Alright, I decided to set out on an impossible mission and try every single Spiritborn build out there. Why? Well, I like farming, I like my Spiritborn, and frankly, I was getting confused by every new best X-trillion or quadrillion easy pit clear build out there. So I figured, why not farm all of the gear for these builds myself and put them through the ringer. Before we get to the actual builds, let's talk about the different websites and resources. I'm not gonna go over every single build on YouTube, because there's frankly way too many, and after a while a lot of them start to blend together anyway. Instead, we're gonna rely on the websites most people will come across when they are looking for a build. All of these often feature variants of the same builds, by the way, which is very logical if you think about it, because in every season there's always gonna be a few skills or items that will outperform the others. So it makes sense to focus on those that combine that one good skill with that one item that makes it even better. That's also the reason why most of the Spiritborn meta is defined by two ancestral uniques. Sepazontek for builds using a basic skill, and the Rod of Kepeleke for those that use a core skill. There are quite a few builds that don't use either and opt for a regular weapon instead, and I of course tested those as well, but they're far less common. I did notice a couple of differences between the four websites though, but it mainly comes to how you use them. Maxroll, in my opinion, sets the gold standard when it comes to the guide itself. All of their builds follow the same structure, they're easy to follow, and most importantly, they offer you a Paragon setup based on how many points you actually have unlocked. Mobalytics has much of what Maxroll provides in terms of information, but the quality of the guide can greatly vary as there is no set team of writers. Instead, any content creator can list their builds there. Usually, that also means that there's no different Paragon board setups based on your current level like Maxroll has. What needs to be said though is that Ace of Spades and Sanctum list their builds there, and at this point most of us know them for figuring out unique tech early and creating absolute powerhouses of builds. When it comes to the other two, I would place Icy Veins closer to Maxroll when it comes to the visual representation, and the four builds to Mobalytics. If you have a favorite creator, chances are you won't ever really use Icy Veins anymore. I used to rely on them in the past for Diablo 3, but with all of the current websites, they've kinda been pushed to the wayside for me personally. Now that you know where to look for quality builds, let's talk about my testing. I took all of them, including that one B-tier build, because yes, Spiritborn is so good, it doesn't even have a C or lower tier build, through the Pit 100, 110, as well as Infernal Hordes, the Undercity, Nightmare Dungeons, and I killed a couple of bosses with them. Or in other words, I took them through the whole endgame loop, because some builds would do great in a pit, but might not be as fast as others for speed farming. I should maybe also mention that I used the mythic variants of every single build that I could. I farmed all of those that can be used for the Spiritborn builds, and even ended up with some extra. If you're just starting out, just know that it might take a while longer for them to get going. I've already said it, but Spiritborn is ridiculous this season. Its arguably worst build is Soar, which was a nightmare in the Pit 100 and made me give up halfway through because I wasn't keeping up with the timer. But boy, if you want something brainless when running through any Torment 4 content, that build just works. All you do is jump up, land, which pulls in enemies around you, and delete them. This and some of the other builds use an item that you will either love or hate though, and that's the Jacint Shell, which constantly drains your HP but heals you whenever you spend Vigor. This item makes you near immortal in combat, as it'll basically out-heal any damage you take, but if you engage an enemy on 1 HP and you take that first hit, well, you're gonna end up paying for repairs. I'd say that the worst part of this build is the camera movement. If you're prone to motion sickness, this might be one you wanna skip, but if you want some bunny hopping speed farming fun, then this build isn't all that bad. This already gets us to the next tier and the Rock Splitter Thorns Spiritborn, which is the first of many that will use Sepazontek. This unique basically supercharges your basic attacks by making them hit harder and always use their third attack in the chain. For Rock Splitter, that means that you'll actively deal Thorns damage to enemies around you while also making those attacks hit harder. I would consider this a decent starter build, especially since it comes online with relatively few uniques and feels like the budget version of the Crushing Hand build we're gonna talk about later. This build performs okay in the pit, but if you want to push high levels, I'd actually recommend building some of the higher ranked builds. A build that isn't listed on Maxroll, but that uses the same unique weapon is Kurast Undercity one. Much like the Rock Splitter one, it does well in Torment 4, but it falls short in higher pit levels. Now, much like how I called the previous build a budget version of the Crushing Hands one, this feels like the budget version of the Quill Volley build. Do keep in mind though that neither of these use the same uniques as the top tier builds. These use Sepazontek, while the other ones will use a Rod of Kepeleke in combination with the Ring of the Midnight Sun, so they're not exactly a stepping stone to those. The last of the Sepazontek builds we're gonna talk about is the Thrash Spiritborn, which ranks higher than the others and for good reason. Whereas I was previously struggling to meet the timer in the pit, this one just shredded through. Its biggest flaw is that it takes a bit longer to kill bosses and that there's gonna be a lot of visual clutter, so you'll have to really focus on the boss mechanic visuals if you don't wanna die and incur a time penalty. That being said, if you prefer the simplicity of Sepazontek, this is definitely the one build to aim for. Before we get to the Rod of Kepeleke builds, which will dominate all tier lists, let's talk about the Evade Eagle one, which I tried both in its pre-nerf state as well as the more recent version. It's kinda pointless to talk about the first iteration of the build, as Blizzard nerfed it and you can't effectively play it anymore. The nerfs were warranted, by the way, as you basically didn't need to finish an evade animation before starting another one, leading to some pretty broken gameplay. The mechanics of the current version are still the same as before though. Every time you evade, you're gonna shoot out Thunderspikes, which is your basic eagle attack. These hit like a truck and should let you one-shot anything that is in Torment 4 or below. I initially struggled in higher pit tiers, but it turned out that I was basically failing to line up the projectiles and I wasn't putting enough thought into where I was dodging towards. So there's a bit of an element of mastery there, but overall it's really not that difficult to pull off correctly. Much like the Soar build, there's also forced movement, and with it, janky camera movement as well. It doesn't bother me too much personally, but keep this in mind before you spend all of your time and resources building one of these. The forced movement, or evading rather, is both this build's greatest strength and its biggest weakness. You'll constantly be evading, so you should be steering clear of most damage, but if you end up in a red puddle you were supposed to dodge, well, you're gonna be paying those repair bills once more. Now, if I understand it correctly, using a macro to spam evade for you is against the TOS, which will turn this build into a real nightmare, as you'll both break your keyboard and that one finger you're using to hit that specific key. The good news is that you can rebind evade to your scroll wheel, so if you have one of those mice with an infinitely spinning scroll wheel, this isn't all that bad though. Also, bonus points to the max roll version, which uses the Centipede ultimate, which we frankly don't see enough of. Before we talk about the top builds, the absolute cream of the crop, we have one more, and that is the Stinger build, which doesn't use any unique weapons but does combine a lot of the abilities that make a Spiritborn fun to play. The Hunter will let you jump around and deal great damage whilst having a relatively high chance of getting the cooldown reset. Ravager will let you teleport between enemies you're attacking, and Vortex will let you group up any of them near you. Vortex is a bit of a game changer for Infernal Hordes, by the way, as it significantly speeds up Spires, which is usually the slowest event you have to complete. The star of the show in this build, the Stinger, deals a hefty amount of damage in a small area around you while healing you and potentially making enemies vulnerable. But again, it uses the Jacint shell, so love it or hate it, I guess. I personally loved the shell when I got to Torment 4 as it made surviving so much easier, but the more gear I unlocked, the more survivable I became and the lower this item ended up on my list. As I stated earlier, I played the mythic version of the build, which uses the Hair of Perdition helmet and the Ring of Starless Skies. Neither are really used in any of the other popular builds, except maybe for the ring if you follow some of Ace of Spades' crazier setups, so crafting these for the sake of this build is kind of overkill in my opinion. Before I move on to the next set of builds, I also want to shout out Don the Crown's Exploding Scourge build, which has two versions. One uses Stinger, the other Touch of Death. I tried the latter, and boy, is it the most fun, under-documented and underrated build out there. The biggest downside for me was that it uses the Jacint shell, but the whole build is centered around turning Scourge into a persistent area of effect that follows you around. So any mob near you will get feared and poisoned, and thanks to the Noxious Resonance capstone ability, your critical hits will cause any enemy you poison to explode and also deal damage to those around them. This build will literally play itself, and it is incredible in farming Torment 4. I've had some of my highest scoring Infernal Hordes runs with it, as well as some of my smoothest Kurast runs. The only thing I started struggling with was higher pit tiers, but I felt so much in love with the playstyle, I'm thinking of trying to improve my gear so I can push to higher tiers. The next 5 builds are the absolute top, not only for Spiritborn, but also in the game. And they all either use a core skill as their main ability, or in the case of Payback and Touch of Death, have a passive that turns them into one. That means that we're gonna go all in on the Rod of Kepeleke and the Ring of the Midnight Sun, with the latter actually being the most important item of the two. The Rod will turn all of your core skills into basic ones and thus make them free to cast, but they'll deal less damage. That doesn't sound great, right? Well, if you cast them at maximum vigor, they'll consume all of it to deal full damage, cast them at their largest size, and are guaranteed critical hits, while also increasing your critical strike damage for every point of vigor you just spent. So in short, you just need to ensure that every single hit is cast at maximum vigor. And to do this, we're gonna use a Ring of the Midnight Sun, which lets you regain up to 50% vigor spent in the last 2 seconds whenever you land a critical hit. The only stat that actually truly matters on this ring is this percentage. If you can't regain all of your vigor every single hit, your damage is gonna go down the drain. That even means that one with 3 greater stats and a low percentage will perform worse than a basic version that replenishes 50% of your vigor. This, by the way, is something that seems to plague a lot of the uniques this season. I also need to say that Ace of Spades found a way to avoid this ring and use the Ring of the Starless Skies instead by propping up your lucky hit chance, but it requires far more specific stats and gear, so it'll probably be more of a long-term goal for most of us. The great thing about these 5 builds is that all of them use the Yen's Blessing boots, and most of them will use the Banished Lord's Talisman, which guarantees that every single hit deals overpowered damage. Combine that with the Mythic Helmet and Chest, and you actually only have 3 items you need to swap between those builds to perform at a top level. The absolute best out there right now is the Quill Volley one. It's ridiculously fast, deals incredible damage, and if you play it right, you won't ever be in danger of dying, except maybe when you're pushing the highest pit levels and are ignoring boss mechanics. And to top it all off, it brings Vortex, one of the best quality of life abilities. Currently, there's also a bugged version that amplifies your damage way beyond what the developers ever intended, and ironically doesn't use Shaco, Yen's Boots, or the Ring of the Midnight Sun. So if you like broken builds, I'd urge you to try it out now, because it's definitely gonna go away next season, if not sooner. I would put a Payback build almost on the same level as the Quill Volley one. It's slightly less powerful, but you'll still be hitting in the trillions or even more. The one advantage I see it having is that Quill Volley adds a bit of range to your attacks, which is nice when used stationary, but I prefer teleporting all over the map with the Ravager, which is easier to do with this build. Crushing Hand pretty much plays the same as Payback, but takes a few different utilities. If you do not care about the absolute top pit levels, there's actually no real difference between these. All your attacks will one-shot everything, so overkilling an enemy by 10 or 100 billion damage doesn't really matter. Then we have the 2 odd ones out. The Rake build will use the Loyalist's Mantle Helmet, and Touch of Death doesn't use a Banished Lord's Talisman. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of using Rake. Not because it's bad, but much like Quill Volley, it adds a bit of range to your attacks, which makes teleporting around slightly more annoying. And if I'm gonna go for that playstyle, I prefer gearing for Quill Volley. Touch of Death plays a bit differently. First of all, you get to use the Jacint Shell again, so again, love it or hate it. But second is that the damage initially needs to ramp up due to how Touch of Death works. I'm talking about mere seconds, by the way, but it is noticeable when you compare it to the other builds. Basically, the way Touch of Death works is that you infect your target, and when the infection expires or the host dies, a swarm will hatch and seek out enemies. And once you get enough of these going, everything on the map will start exploding. This slight delay is quite handy when you're doing spires during Infernal Hordes, as well as when you start fighting enemies in higher pit tiers, because they stay alive for a while, which basically makes the delay matter less. But if you're speed farming or doing any general Torment 4 content, I feel like the other builds are just that tiny bit better. That pretty much covers most of the Spiritborn builds out there. The different websites will sometimes focus on different stats, but they will generally get you where you need to be. It's actually more important to understand why they decide to focus on these. Spiritborn has a couple of unique interactions, not only for the items we just discussed, but also for some of the Paragon boards. Viscous Shield, for example, should technically only increase your damage by about 33%, but because of the way the game's programmed, you can infinitely scale your damage by focusing on increasing your HP. The same goes for the aspect of Redirected Force and Interdiction, which makes clever use of the fact that block chance doesn't appear to be capped at 100%, despite this being mentioned in the game, leading to another infinitely scaling damage modifier. So make sure that whatever website or guide you choose to follow, you understand their reasoning for focusing on a certain stat or taking specific legendary aspects, because the tiniest change could make a world of difference. My Spiritborn journey won't end here, by the way. I intend to try and further improve my gear for almost all of the builds I just talked about, and I want to see how many of them I can use to beat the Pit 150. I'll probably document this in another video, and I'm gonna do a lot of the farming on stream, so come check me out over on twitch.tv/fandral. I also plan to make a similar video for all of the other classes, so if there is one you want to see first, let me know in the comments down below. And while you're at it, I'd really appreciate if you could like the video and subscribe, as I've basically switched games and I will now have to rebuild most of my channel.